Assalamualaikum and hi everyone. So now we move to chapter 7, gases exchange and its control. So under this chapter there are 3 subtopics: 7.1 gases exchange and control in mammals, 7.2 role of chemoreceptors in controlling breathing, 7.3 gases exchange and control in plants. Learning outcomes for subtopic 7.1 gases exchange and controls in mammals. The first one, analyze the oxygen dissociation curve of hemoglobin and myoglobin. The second one, compare oxygen dissociation curve of hemoglobin and myoglobin. And the third one is to analyze the effect of the changes in partial pressure of carbon dioxide towards oxygen dissociation curve, which is the BOHR effect. The relationship between partial pressure of oxygen and saturation of respiratory pigment is called the oxygen dissociation curve. So the affinity of a respiratory pigment for oxygen is measured by determining the percentage saturation of blood with the oxygen after exposure to air containing different partial pressure of oxygen. So the oxygen concentration is measured in terms of partial pressure of oxygen, and the oxygen tension in the unit kilopascal. So secara ringkasnya lah, oxygen dissociation curve ini adalah menunjukkan hubungan antara tekanan the partial pressure ataupun tekanan oksigen dan juga tekanan partial pressure kat sini kita this one lah, antara the oxygen tension, oxygen tension itu ataupun the partial pressure of oxygen dan juga saturation of respiratory pigment, saturation of the hemoglobin lah maksudnya respiratory pigment adalah hemoglobin, so saturation of respiratory pigment with the oxygen. So kita tengok perkaitan antara dua nilai-nilai. So bila kita plotkan dan dapatlah curve yang kita panggil oxygen dissociation curve. The oxygen dissociation curve or ODC for hemoglobin. So ini adalah the ODC. The curve here adalah ODC of hemoglobin. Shows the percentage saturation, the percentage saturation of hemoglobin with the oxygen at various partial pressure of oxygen. So at various oxygen tension ataupun di sini kita also known as the partial pressure. Partial pressure of oxygen. Dia bracket PO2. Meaning partial pressure of oxygen. So the ODC for hemoglobin here shows the percentage saturation of hemoglobin at various partial pressure of oxygen. And the oxygen dissociation curve for the hemoglobin is sigmoid. Dia punya structure ni adalah sigmoid. Dia punya curve dia, curve dia sigmoid. So this is the result of the cooperative binding of oxygen to 4 polypeptide chains of hemoglobin. So hemoglobin ni dia ada 4 polypeptide chains. 4 polypeptide chains. So the binding of oxygen, the binding of oxygen to the oxygen subunit induces the others to change the shape and increase their affinity for oxygen. So bila satu bind, yang tiga lagi seterusnya. Bila satu oxygen, bila one molecule of oxygen bind to the polypeptide, so another 3, akan ada 3 lagi molecule of oxygen terus akan binding to the polypeptide. Itu kita panggil the cooperative binding. Cooperative binding of oxygen to 4 polypeptide chain of hemoglobin. So hemoglobin binds with oxygen to form oxyhemoglobin. So the ability of oxygen to bind to hemoglobin or release from hemoglobin mainly depends on the partial pressure of oxygen partial pressure of carbon dioxide, pH and temperature. Okay, so when you look here, okay, the graph here, so hemoglobin becomes almost fully saturated with oxygen, okay, up to 98%. So kalau kita buat satu garisan kat sini, okay, nampak di sini so kat sini lebih kurang 98%, okay, sahaja. It can't reach 100% because some oxygen will dissolve into the plasma. Okay, so untuk lebih kurang, okay, so kalau lihat kat sini, as it passes, hemoglobin passes through the lungs, the partial pressure of oxygen is about 100 mmHg. The partial pressure of oxygen ni 100, okay, unit dia millimeter Hg. So hemoglobin become almost fully saturated. Di sini fully saturated, almost fully saturated with oxygen. Okay, up to 98%. Okay, 98% sahaja. Okay, so dia tak boleh capai 100%. Kenapa? Because ada some oxygen tu dia akan dissolve terus ke dalam into the plasma. Okay. Okay, so the ODC of hemoglobin we can divide it into 3 parts. Okay, 1, 2 and 3. Okay, so the affinity of hemoglobin to oxygen is high even when the partial pressure of oxygen is low. Okay, example, when the blood leave, okay, when the blood leave the alveolus, okay, for this section, for number 3, okay, I divide into 3, so we discuss first to this part. Okay, so here when blood leave the alveolus or lungs, okay, and move towards tissues, okay, the partial pressure of oxygen drops from 100 to 40. So dia akan drop, okay, daripada 100 to 40, okay, from 100 mm Hg to 40 mm Hg. Okay, so ini dalam keadaan in most tissues during resting condition, dalam keadaan resting. Okay, dalam keadaan resting, bila blood leave the alveolus, leave the lungs ataupun alveolus, so they move toward to the tissue lah. So partial pressure of oxygen daripada 100 here, okay, so daripada 100 dia gerak kepada 40, tekanan tinggal 40 okay, walaupun 40 kali lihat, the tissue still have 75%. Okay, so this one kalian lihat still have 75% saturated, the percentage saturation of hemoglobin with the oxygen masih tinggi, 75%. Okay, 75%. So the remaining 75% of oxygen will act as a oxygen reserve here. Okay, so only 25% of oxygen available on the hemoglobin is given to tissues. Okay, so hemoglobin has a lower affinity for oxygen and release some of its oxygen to the tissues. Okay, dalam keadaan this one lah. Okay, ni dalam keadaan resting condition. Okay, boleh okay, so kalau saya repeat balik lah. Okay, kalau lihat bila blood leave the alveolus, so the partial pressure of oxygen from 100 bergerak kepada 40, dia turun, tekanan dia turun kepada 40 mm Hg. Okay, but the percentage saturation of hemoglobin with the oxygen masih tinggi, 75%. Okay, 75% lagi ada oksigen dan reserve. Okay. Okay, then seterusnya, when blood reaches the respiring tissues during exercise. Okay, during the exercise where partial pressure of oxygen very low. Okay, tadi kita stop sampai 40 and then untuk yang number 2 part bahagian kedua ni, bila tisu kita lakukan exercise lah ini dalam keadaan respiring tissues, okay, during exercise. So where the partial pressure of oxygen very low, okay, hemoglobin affinity towards the oxygen will decrease. Okay, this causes oxyhemoglobin to dissociate into oxygen and hemoglobin rapidly. So hemoglobin give up most of its oxygen to the tissues. Okay, so this is shown by the steepest part of the curve. Okay, so here the percentage of oxygen, kau lihat, okay, the percentage of oxygen saturated with the hemoglobin. Okay, ataupun the percentage of hemoglobin saturated with the oxygen will decrease. Okay, the decrease. At low partial pressure of oxygen, okay, pada 20, okay, 20 ada here 20 mmHg, hemoglobin is only berapa? Kau lihat kat sini, tinggal 35% saja. Okay, saturated with the oxygen. Okay. Okay. So when the partial pressure of oxygen reduces below 20 mmHg mercury, so less than 20 mmHg, so more oxyhemoglobin will release its oxygen. Okay, kita ulang semula untuk ODC of hemoglobin ataupun oxygen dissociation curve of hemoglobin. Okay, pada tekanan ataupun partial pressure of oxygen 100 mmHg. Okay, so kalau lihat the percentage, the percent saturation of hemoglobin with the oxygen, hanya 98% sahaja. Okay, so graf kat sebelah ni pun sama. Okay, hanya 98% sahaja saturated, hemoglobin saturated dengan oksigen pada partial pressure of oxygen yang paling tinggi lah. Ini dekat lungs, pada lungs. Kenapa tak boleh capai 100%? Because some oxygen will dissolve into the plasma, so dapat 98% saja. Percent saturation of hemoglobin ni dengan oksigen. Okay, so when the blood leave the lungs ataupun alveolus, ini dalam keadaan resting. Kalian lihat orang ni baring je, resting. Okay, they move toward to the tissue lah. So the partial pressure of oxygen dia akan drop. Okay, ini towards to the tissue. So the partial pressure of oxygen drops daripada from 100 to the 40 mmHg. Okay. So during resting condition, di mana hemoglobin has lower affinity for oxygen and release some of its oxygen to the tissues. Okay, but it still have 75%. Okay, so bila kita tarik kat sini dia ada 75% hemoglobin, saturation of hemoglobin ni dengan oxygen. Okay, so kat sini pun sama juga. So kalau kita plot, okay, so tarik ada lebih kurang 75%. Okay, masih tinggi lagi. Okay, masih tinggi lagi. Okay, so hemoglobin leave the tissue. When hemoglobin leave the tissue, it is still 75% saturated. Okay, and then bila you buat vigorously exercise lah, okay, in vigorously contracting muscle, so the partial pressure of oxygen from the 40 dia akan reduce from 40, okay, dia akan reduce lagi daripada 40 to 20 mmHg. So the tendency of hemoglobin, the oxyhemoglobin to release oxygen is greater. So the percentage of oxygen saturated with hemoglobin will decrease. So ini ditunjukkan by the steepest part of the curve here. So at low partial pressure of oxygen 20 mmHg ni, kalau lihat hemoglobin is only about berapa? Ada 35%. Okay, is about 35% saturated dengan oxygen. So bila reduce lagi, Okay, less than 20 millimeter Hg dia punya partial pressure. So more oxyhemoglobin will release its oxygen. Okay, so here the more the curve is displaced to the right. Okay, kalian lihat dia bergerak to the right. Okay, to the right, the less readily the hemoglobin pick up oxygen ataupun the more easily it release oxygen. Okay, dia bergerak to the left. Okay, so the more more easily release the oxygen lah, the hemoglobin Kalau the curve is displaced the more the curve is displaced to the left. Okay, dia ke atas lah. Okay, to the left. Okay, it's displaced to the left. The more readily the hemoglobin pick up oxygen and the less readily it release the oxygen. Okay, so kalau buat ke atas ataupun ke kiri lah ke kiri dan ke atas. Okay, so less readily the hemoglobin to release the oxygen. Okay, kalau dia bergerak ke bawah to the right. Okay, to the right, so the more easily it release the oxygen. Okay. Okay, so for the myoglobin pula, myoglobin ni beza dengan hemoglobin adalah myoglobin the red pigment in muscle, very similar to the hemoglobin subunit. Okay, but dia ada only single polypeptide chain. That's why dia has only one heme group. So they act as emergency oxygen store in muscle. Okay, myoglobin has a higher affinity for oxygen than hemoglobin. So myoglobin akan release oxygen only when partial pressure of oxygen is very low. So the ODC for myoglobin is hyperbolic curve. Why hyperbolic? Because dia hanya ada satu polypeptide chain sahaja. Okay, so now kita tengok the ODC, oxygen dissociation curve of myoglobin. Tadi saya disebut okay, dalam slide sebelum ni, the more the curve is displaced to the left. Okay, so the more readily the hemoglobin pick up the oxygen and the less readily it release oxygen. So kalau dia lebih ke displaced to the left, maknanya dia less readily to release dia punya oxygen. Okay, so here we look ODC for myoglobin is shifted to the left of hemoglobin. Okay, yang here yang hijau ni adalah myoglobin. Kalian lihat, okay, dia shifted to the left of hemoglobin. So maksudnya myoglobin has higher affinity for oxygen than hemoglobin. So allow the myoglobin to obtain the oxygen from oxyhemoglobin when oxyhemoglobin reaches blood capillary in muscle. Okay, so sebab myoglobin ni adalah dia akan store the oxygen ni dalam masa kan. Okay, myoglobin is still highly saturated with the oxygen. Kalau lihat kat sini pada tekanan 20 mm Hg ni, so myoglobin is still highly saturated with the oxygen. Okay, so kalian lihat berapa dia punya ni, lebih kurang 70 lebih peratus kan. Okay, dia punya tekanan berbanding dengan kalau lihat untuk hemoglobin ni tinggal 40%. Lebih kurang macam itulah Okay, so masih tinggi. Okay, 70 lebih peratus lebih kurang saturation of the saturation of the myoglobin tu dengan oksigen. Untuk myoglobin tu tinggi. Okay, so dia punya highly myoglobin is still highly saturated with oxygen even when partial pressure of oxygen is low. Okay, pada 20 mm Hg. Okay, so that's why myoglobin has a higher affinity towards the oxygen even at low partial pressure of oxygen. Okay, its percentage saturation with the oxygen is still high. Okay, then here myoglobin only begins to release oxygen when the partial pressure of oxygen is below 20 mm Hg. So kalian lihat pada 10 mm Hg. So for the myoglobin, kalian lihat pertama sekali dia still has a high percentage of oxygen okay, berbanding dengan hemoglobin. So here is the hemoglobin. Okay, hemoglobin still the percentage the is still high lah, percentage saturation with oxygen is still high. So myoglobin only releasing oxygen when oxygen level in the blood is very low. Okay, very low So the act here myoglobin act as an intercellular storage for oxygen. Okay, ensure that aerobic respiration continues for as long as possible before anaerobic respiration takes over. Okay, so myoglobin here kalian lihat okay, they act as a store of oxygen in resting muscle. Okay, only releasing it when supply of oxyhemoglobin have been exhausted. The ability of oxygen to combine with hemoglobin or release from oxyhemoglobin is influenced by several factors. Okay, itu tadi kita terangkan dari segi partial pressure of oxygen. Selain daripada partial pressure of oxygen, partial pressure of carbon dioxide pun juga akan affect the ODC. If the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high, also the temperature is high. Okay, so when the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is higher, so the pH will lower. So in the above situation, the conformation of hemoglobin is modified. Okay, so the affinity of hemoglobin to oxygen pun akan decrease lah. Okay, akan berkurang. So di mana ODC kalian lihat the normal one di tengah ni. Okay, and then bila berlaku the above situation, the above maknanya dalam keadaan partial pressure of carbon dioxide is higher, temperature also higher, and the pH pula lower, the ODC akan shift to the right. Okay, dia akan berganjak ke sebelah kanan dan ke bawah lah. Okay, ODC shift to the right. So di mana oxyhemoglobin dissociate easily, easily to supply a sufficient amount of oxygen needed by actively respiring tissue. Okay. So in actively respiring tissue, cellular respiration occurs. So the concentration of carbon dioxide will increase. Okay, bila concentration of carbon dioxide increase, so itu menunjukkan dia punya partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high kan. Bila high, seterusnya menunjukkan the concentration of H+ turut akan meningkat. Bila H+ meningkat, pH akan berkurang lah. Okay, decrease pH decrease. Okay, so carbon dioxide apa berlaku? Carbon dioxide akan join with water to form carbonic acid H2CO3. Okay, so from anaerobic respiration, lactate is formed. So both process dia akan reduce pH in red blood cells, so menyebabkan blood tu jadi lebih berasid lah, acidity of the blood. So when pH is low, it modifies the conformation of hemoglobin. So affinity of hemoglobin to oxygen will reduce. So hemoglobin will release oxygen more readily. So this the ODC akan shifted to the right lah. Okay, so here to the right. Okay, because of the pH dia ni, pH dia reduce kan. Okay, so sufficient amount of oxygen can be supplied to where it is most needed. So the displacement of the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve by a change in pH is known as BOHR effect. Okay. Okay, so for the blood pH pun sama juga. When pH rendah reduce, ataupun lower, so maksudnya high acidity lah. So the affinity of hemoglobin towards oxygen pun akan reduce. So the curve shift to the right juga. Okay, so because of the concentration of H+ is high, so pH akan jadi rendah lah, lower. So the curve akan shift to the right. So more oxygen is delivered to acidic site which are working harder. And last sekali for the blood temperature. So when blood temperature increase, okay, so the affinity of hemoglobin towards oxygen akan reduce. So the curve also daripada dalam keadaan normal body temperature 38 degrees Celsius. So bila body temperature increase to 43 degrees Celsius, so kalian lihat the curve akan shift to the right. Okay. So maksudnya bila dia bergerak ke to the right, so more oxygen is delivered to the warm up tissues. Okay. So ini adalah bahagian active tissue. Bila kita buat exercise kan, so more oxygen is released here. Okay.